Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel, New Frontiers in Cancer. We're so glad that you're here. My name's Elizabeth Cohen, and I'll be moderating this panel with these three wonderful experts, and I'll quickly introduce them to you. To my left is Amir Ali Talazaz, and he is the co-CEO of Guardant Health. Amir Ali has been here in this room before a few years ago, and a bear appeared at the window. It totally distracted everyone. If that happens again, we're going to blame him. The bear has some interest because it's him twice. Well, we'll see if we get a little visitor. And Rodney Gillespie is the head of oncology at Novartis. And Alex Marson is a professor in immunology, an immunologist at UCSF. So let's start. We're going to be talking about innovations today, and we're going to start with screening. So Amir Ali, let's talk about the screening that we know and the screening that's in the future and the screening that maybe is here now, but people don't know about it. People know about mammograms. They know about colonoscopies. What's available now that maybe people don't know about that's in advance on those two or offers another option to those kinds of modalities?
Yeah, thanks for having us in this panel. It's very exciting. So when we look at actually the field of oncology, there's been some screening methodologies available for some time for 5 different cancer types: colorectal cancer, breast cancer, prostate, lung cancer, and cervical. And very interestingly, recently there was a study published to look at the efficacy of cancer screening in those cancer types versus some of the best-in-class therapeutics. The data, if I recall right, looked at patients who got analyzed since 1975 to 2020, and the final results was what you can expect. Cancer screening and early detection is the most important intervention that you can do, testing that you can do to improve long-term survivals for the patients. Now, when we look at the healthcare system, especially in the United States, for too long, our healthcare has become a care for sickness, managing diseases, treating those diseases. There's nothing wrong with taking care of our sick people, but sometimes it's coming at the expense of putting less attention on prevention of the disease and caring for health and guarding wellness. Overall, when we look at like $5 trillion expenditure that we have in US healthcare system, more than $4 trillion of it is getting spent on disease management and treatment. So now, when we look at actually the screening options which we have out there, for very few cancer types we have options. For many of them, we don't have screening technologies. Even for the ones that we have, the rate of compliance to those screening tests is much less than desired. Now, what if I tell you, when you go and you see your primary care physician, with a simple blood test during annual checkup or any kind of care encounter, you can find cancers at early stage? Isn't that be very exciting? That's the future that we were hoping for so long. There were many researchers who actually contributed in this field way beyond our company. And I'm very happy to say that now there is an FDA-approved blood test for cancer screening with the first indication for colorectal cancer, a cancer type which cancer death is preventable as long as you can detect it at early stage. There are evidence-based studies that we know screening can detect cancers at earlier stages and improve survival. But the problem is 1 out of 3 people who are eligible for cancer screening are not doing it for different kind of reasons. And now this blood test could be an additional choice for patients.
I'm going to interrupt you for 1 minute. Say that 1 out of 3 again.
1 out of 3 eligible patients who can do colorectal cancer screening at age 45 and above, which they should do colorectal cancer screening, they don't do it. Although we had modalities like colonoscopy or stool-based tests, some for over a decade, some for over 2 decades, very effective methodologies, but for different reasons, patients are not complying to those tests.
Is the blood test better is it going to increase the chances of catching a cancer, or it's just an alternative to the colonoscopy or fecal occult, the stool test that people often don't like to do?
So blood testing would be a new choice, a new option, which can be used similar to other non-invasive colorectal cancer screening tests. Gold standard is colonoscopies. The recommendation would be for people age 45 and above who have access, are willing to do colonoscopy, to really do the colonoscopy. But the reality is more than half of the people are not doing their colonoscopy. And some of it is just the reality of access, the prep, the time commitment, and some of the support system that needs to be around you in order to go through that procedure. We are also very close at the capacity of colonoscopies that we can do in this country. We have capacity of about 6 million annual screening colonoscopies, and we are doing about 5.5. What's the result? Sometimes you have to wait for colonoscopies to get the appointment for 3 to 9 months. And now, this highlights the importance of this new option, a blood test for cancer screening, which we are very excited about.
So a blood test to screen for colorectal cancer is available from you. I think you mentioned another company as well. How about for other types of cancers?
So this is a field that from maybe 10 years ago looked like kind of mission impossible to see these days. And now a lot of investment has come to this field, which is going to bring much brighter future for all of us. We are just a contributor in that field. We were the first one to get FDA approval for a primary colorectal cancer screening that now over 50 million people have access to in terms of insurance, but there are other players too. Now, in terms of other cancer types, the same blood test, like the blood test that we developed named SHIELD, is developed for multi-cancer detection. We recently got FDA breakthrough device designation for that test for screening for 8 different cancer types. National Cancer Institute selected this test for their upcoming multi-cancer detection trial, Vanguard study, which is going to start soon. So the vision that I talked about earlier, when you see your PCPs, you can get tested for multi-cancer, is not far away from today.
Rodney or Alex, do you want to talk about prevention?
Yeah, I'll be happy to jump in as well. I want to double click maybe on what was just discussed and talk about a couple other areas, breast cancer, prostate cancer, and the data is very similar. So for prostate cancer, would you believe that only 1/3 of patients who are eligible are actually getting their prostate cancer screening, so their PSA tests? And women are always much better, but it's still only 1 out of every 2. So there's significant room for improvement.
Women are 1 out of 2 for
mammograms.
Okay.
Right? So basic PSA and mammograms. So 1 out of 2 women are getting their that are eligible for it are getting their mammogram. So it's a huge opportunity for improvement. And as was said, it's so clear. The data just speaks for itself. When you get early diagnosis, if you're diagnosed with a cancer, prostate cancer or breast cancer, your chances of survival are significant. One piece of data coming out of Johns Hopkins, it shows that the 20-year survival rate for men who are diagnosed early with prostate cancer is over 95%. Over 95%. You're probably going to die from something else and not prostate cancer if you get diagnosed early. And for women who get their breast cancer, the data shows that you could probably save 1/3 of women, prevent deaths from 1/3 of women by being diagnosed early, as well as getting quality and affordable care at the same time. So early testing, at the end of the day, saves lives. That's really the formula. And a couple of things I just wanted to mention that Novartis is doing. We're actively involved, and it's a very passionate area for me in particular. We have an initiative called Your Attention Please, and this is an initiative that in the first 8 weeks, it drove over 10,000 women to the site. And at that site, it gives them direction on where to go get a mammogram. So hopefully they follow through on it and they get if they're diagnosed. But imagine that. You can save, if it's for every 1,000 that go, and every 1,000 that are diagnosed, or even every 100, it's 33 women for every 100, 333 for every 1,000. So it makes a huge difference. And then we also have an initiative that we're working on for breast cancer called, we call it ABCD, Advanced Breast Cancer Diagnosis. And it's a policy initiative where we're working with private payers and really trying to require them to pay for more than just mammograms, because quite honestly, most payers pay for mammograms. But sometimes women need to go further. They need another step in that diagnosis. They need additional imaging to be done. And a lot of women sort of drop out at that stage because it's unaffordable. So we're really helping to fight to make sure it's affordable, but it's also being paid for by the private insurers. And not to leave the men out, in prostate cancer, we have a huge initiative, a landmark initiative. We're a founding partner with Zero Prostate Cancer. It's an initiative. We put in about $7.5 million to this initiative, and our goal is to save 100,000 lives in the next 10 years. And this initiative, yeah, you can clap. Yeah. Save 100,000 lives in the next 10 years. And this is not an initiative where we're just educating, but of course we're going to educate, we're going to help with diagnosis, help with screening, but we're also going to analyze the data and give it back to the men so they understand and they can communicate in their communities. And we're going to those communities that are underserved and most at risk as well.
Alex, let's talk about treatment. I'm sort of imagining you being like a kid in a candy store, all these cool things are out there. Let's talk about things that are not currently in use. Either they're in your head or they're being studied that nobody here could get, but you're super excited to get your hands on it at some point in the future.
Yeah. I mean, you heard about the opportunities in detecting cancer early, but ultimately, detecting cancer has to be coupled with curing it. And I am here to say that I am incredibly optimistic that we are seeing a new wave of cures for cancer. Now, this has been promised for a long time, and I realize that a lot of people feel that this has been overpromised and underdelivered. But for decades, really the mainstays of, if you get diagnosed with cancer, it's cut it out, give chemotherapy, which is brutal and has side effects, and give radiation. And that's still largely the mainstay. And a corollary of that is, unfortunately, metastatic cancer has largely been treated as something that you can maybe extend life, but cures don't get talked about that often. But all of this is changing with the ability to unlock the immune system to go after cancer. And so this is really a new road of attack. The drugs don't look like conventional drugs in many places. What it fundamentally is we all have our immune system that has evolved to circulate in our body and protect us from disease. It's largely evolved to protect us from infections, but we already have these white blood cells that are circulating through our body that are specialized to go and find cells that are unhealthy and eliminate them. And what immunotherapy is really a set of drugs that unleash the power of our existing immune systems, give those white blood cells the power to not only recognize cancer cells, but to effectively eliminate them. And this comes in a number of different flavors. Some people here have heard of checkpoint blockade. These are drugs that can be given to generally unleash cells in the immune system. This is what Jimmy Carter got that effectively cured his melanoma that had already metastasized to the brain. And that was unthinkable a decade before that, even a couple years before that. Actually, I just as an aside, on my way in here, I met someone who asked what I do, and she told me that her husband had been diagnosed with metastatic kidney cancer, and conventional therapies gave him no hope. He was ready to give up, and he got checkpoint blockade, and he's cancer-free and doing great.
That's amazing.
And that's the kind of story that gives me hope. And I think that is just the beginning. That's where there's already approved drugs. We're already seeing the next iteration of approved drugs, and Novartis has been one of the leaders here, which is in the form of CAR T cells. Raise your hand if you've heard of CAR T cells. Yeah, so this sounds kind of science fiction-y. These are patients' own cells become a living medicine. Patients go in, they give a blood sample, the cells get shipped off to a cell factory that genetically engineers them to add a new gene into them that allows those white blood cells, the T cells, instead of recognizing whatever they're naturally programmed to recognize, each one gets programmed to recognize something on the surface of cancer cells. So as they get reinfused into patients, they'll go and eliminate the cancer cells. And this is, talking about standard of care, this is now part of the care that's standard for certain types of leukemia, lymphoma, and multiple myeloma. So for blood cancers, there are now CAR T cells. The relapse rates are still too high. A lot of patients still don't respond, but we're seeing cures. And there are, for example, pediatric patients who have had decades of cures with these, and patients who would have gone home on hospice instead are living their lives healthy. And now, if you look forward, I think what we see now, right now, so I think 2024 in particular was a real turning point, was that these genetically engineered cells are not just for blood cancers. We're starting to see the early signal that they can work for solid tumors. We're starting to see hope, even in some of the worst types of cancer, brain cancer, kidney cancer. There's clinical trials for a number of common major drivers of cancer mortality, and we hope to now, looking forward, have the tools to extend this to colon cancer, breast cancer, pancreatic cancer, where it's desperately needed. What gives me the hope is that all of a sudden biology is, this is almost a cliche among scientists, biology is in its golden era. We have tools that were unimaginable. We not only have the ability to genetically engineer cells, but we have new ways of doing it with CRISPR, where we can go in and find the DNA inside of each one of those white blood cells and program them to do exactly what we want, to recognize what we want them to recognize, but also program how long they'll last and what they'll do when they actually encounter a cancer cell. We're using the power of AI to further enhance our creativity of programming these cells. And looking forward, it's not just going to be sending these cells off to a centralized factory. That slows us down and makes these much more expensive. There's going to be a number of ways that these can be delivered to every patient. And one of the things I'm personally putting a big bet on in the institute that I run is that we will have an injection, where we'll be able to have a patient and inject CRISPR into their body, direct it specifically to the cells in their immune system, and give genetic instructions to the T cells to recognize and eliminate cancer, so that this could be scaled up and delivered around the world. Not that science fiction-y.
Alex, you used the C word, cure,
Yeah.
which a lot of cancer specialists do not use that word. So tell me why you used it.
I think that we've settled for a long time with the ability, with what we've seen of just extending life. And when I was in medical school, which wasn't that long ago, cancer immunotherapy was totally a marginal endeavor. I was heavily dissuaded from even thinking about it. Actually, I didn't go into oncology. I went into infectious disease because I was told that the immune system was going to have no role in cancer. And I think that that's changed. What was the fad when I was in medical school, and this was meaningful, were drugs that targeted cancer mutations. The problem was that every time you got to a cancer mutation, you might make the cancer shrink, but the cancer would develop resistance and come back. And we saw prolongation of life, which was meaningful, improved quality of life, but we didn't see these cures. With the immune therapy, it's not every patient, but we are seeing patients who get one-time treatments where either it's checkpoint blockade or genetically engineered cells that lead to cancer-free life for years to over a decade. So it's a real shift in the way we're thinking about what's possible in treating patients with cancer.
And a question for any of you. If I had cancer and I went to just sort of like any given doctor, not necessarily an academic, not necessarily someone like Alex, they're going to offer surgery, chemo, radiation, depending upon what the cancer is. Can I be sure that they're going to discuss with me things that are more cutting edge than that? Or is it you're not quite sure and you kind of need to do your own research? As things are moving so quickly, which situation are we in? Can you be, and just to draw a silly comparison, if I have a sore throat, I'm going to go to my PCP, they're going to give me a throat culture. I know it, I don't need to shop around, that's a sure thing. With cancer, do you need to shop around to find someone who is going to know about the more cutting edge approaches?
I'm happy to jump in with a thought there. I would actually say, first off, whenever you have cancer, you should talk to more than one doctor, right? So that's just sort of a general rule of thumb. Whether it's your oncologist, get a second opinion. I mean, cancer is an important disease. But innovation is moving so fast. It is really moving so fast, and not everyone is on top of every single thing that's going on. So it's important that we do our homework. And I think what you're seeing today is more people are doing their homework. They're doing the work using AI, using ChatGPT, whatever it is, and they're coming in ready to have that conversation. One particular therapy, in addition to CAR T that Novartis has innovated in, is around radioligand therapy. And not to make that really, can I ask, has anybody ever heard of radioligand therapy? Okay, not as many people. So to make it really simple, and right now probably the biggest area where radioligand therapy is active and in the market is in prostate cancer. And so what it is a ligand. It's a molecule that we develop in a lab, and then radio is exactly what you think, a radioactive sort of isotope. And what we do is we bring the two of them together. So the ligand it's almost like a smart bomb, for a lack of a better word. It knows exactly where to go, where the bad cells are. It goes to the bad cells, and then the radioactive piece is what destroys the cancer cell, and leaving intact mostly your good cells, right? So it's very targeted therapy. I know we talk about precision medicine and getting very targeted, and what it does is, obviously, for those patients who have advanced prostate cancer, it gives them another option. But that's a new technology. It hasn't been around for a long time. Not every physician is on top of it and understands it. So you have to make sure you're having those conversations. But things like the CAR T, radioligand therapy, it's moving so fast. And that's a really important area for us, because I think the other piece that's really important is patients are looking for not just drugs that work, but drugs that have less side effects, and so they can continue to live a good quality of life. So it's just, you don't want to have a drug you take, but then you can't do anything. You're sitting at home and you can't leave the house and you have these terrible side effects. So I think that's where innovation is going towards, a small a therapeutic window where you have high efficacy and low side effects. And we have to always have those conversations with our providers.
Maybe I can add some additional information for you guys. Last 10 to 15 years, we made a lot of good progress in terms of making sure people across many centers, many community health centers can get access to good quality care. If we go back 10, 15 years ago, there were anecdotal cases, maybe some academic centers who were using what we call precision oncology to do enough testing on a patient to figure out what treatment has a higher chance of success, or to enroll the patient in appropriate clinical trials, high-quality clinical trials. It took 10, 15 years, a lot of efforts, but the part that, for instance, we contributed, we also have a blood test for advanced cancer management that we launched in 2014. It took us 10 years to convince all commercial payers that clinical utility is there. Although we had FDA approval, we had a bunch of 500 publications. But today, after 10 years, every month, 7,000 oncologists out of total 10, 12,000 oncologists is using that test. A third of all cancer patients are getting tested with that test, and there are other players too. But the point is, now, even if the patients go to community care, through this democratization of precision oncology, the access has become much better. But the reality is, it should not take 10 years.
So speaking now here today, are there, if I'm going to my doctor, I want to get whatever cancer detection, prevention tests I can get, detection tests that I can get, can I be sure that my PCP will know what to tell me, or are there some that he or she might not know about?
So we just got FDA approval a year ago for our cancer screening test, Shield for colorectal cancer. Now, if you're age 65 and above, you have access to this test very nicely through Medicare, Medicare Advantage plans, or if you're a VA beneficiary, you have access to this test. But going back to that story of it took us 10 years for our advanced cancer blood test to be accessible for all patients. If the classical diagnostic story holds up, probably it's going to take us long term for that life-saving test to become accessible for all patients at age 45 to 64. Let me give you a patient story that maybe would make the importance of this more tangible. A real patient story, but for sake of this discussion, I named that person Joe. A construction worker in 60s, the bread maker of the family, never had, based on what we've heard at the end, never had the opportunity to get colorectal cancer screening. Blood test is routine, got tested, long story short, got diagnosed with stage 2 colorectal cancer. We don't know what's going to happen to Joe, but by statistics, he has 90% chance of very long-term survival. If this cancer was in his colon for a little bit longer and became metastasized, less than 14% chance of 5-year survival for the bread maker of that family, construction worker. We believe this kind of preventative test, including cancer screening, is a right for everybody, and not just a privilege for the most affluent patients who are willing to do self-pay and cover the cost of these innovative tests. But we have work in front of us. Unlike some of the therapeutics that throughout the years, the policy and infrastructure has been made in such a way that once there is a breakthrough therapeutics that goes through approval, more than often patients get some kind of access to that therapeutics. For diagnostics, and especially cancer screening, it takes years. HPV screening for cervical screening got FDA approval for primary screening in 2014. Got included in the guidelines 4 years after. The last time some of the major guidelines look at colorectal cancer screening was before pandemic. So we are hoping, for the sake of patient benefit, to make sure the value of this kind of innovative tests would get democratized to everybody, and then all the doctors, all the patients would get access to this life-saving test to see more on-time actions by the guideline bodies and policymakers. So this last mile, which sometimes becomes the longest last mile, can get expedited.
I might just add, I think there might almost be a corollary of this period of rapid change. I talked about the hope of it, but I do think it also makes it, in some ways, a challenging time to navigate care as a patient, because there are options that are out there, and it might not be the first thing your doctor mentions. I've had this experience a couple of times with my primary care doctor. I'm aware of non-invasive blood tests, and I've said, should I get one? My primary care doctor says, I don't even really know too much about that. I think that there is still an inertia in the system of the way that medicine is practiced over decades that doesn't always respond quickly to what's available and is proving out to be effective. Same thing true on the treatment side. We don't know all the data yet, but there are anecdotes that are starting to come up, for example, of cancer vaccines. Very similar to the technology that the mRNA lipid nanoparticles for what proved useful for COVID is also being used for personalized cancer vaccines. A number of different companies are offering these. Where it fits into the existing standard of care is really not clear. Some patients are getting these through concierge treatments. Some patients are going to Germany. It's not the mainstream, and it's a little unclear where it's going to be plugged in. And I think it's especially challenging for patients because if you start going down these routes of things that might have promise, might not have much downside, like the case of a vaccine, you might foreclose options of being part of clinical trials for other things. There's a lot of things that are popping up, and as we have this increasing armamentarium of options, we need to have a system that can be nimble and respond to the options and actually help patients navigate the system.
One additional thing just to add, because it's so important, the benefit of guidelines is something that each and every one of us. So in cancer, it's NCCN guidelines that are out there, and it's almost a menu and a formula for any physician to go and follow. So even if your own provider hasn't heard of it before, or some of the latest modalities that are available, if they go look at the guidelines for colorectal cancer, prostate cancer, breast, whatever they may be, it's outlined so well, and it's evidence-based medicine. So it's not guessing, it's evidence-based. It's hard to get into the guidelines, and it's really a great tool that any provider can use, including primary care, or especially in the community, because a lot of us nowadays, we want to get care where we live. We don't want to go and drive to these big academic centers in the middle of New York City or in Houston or in California. We want to get high quality care right in our own community, and I think these type of guidelines allows that to happen as well.
Let's talk about young people for a minute. Younger people are getting diagnosed with cancer at higher rates than before. Can we talk a little bit about, is that just reporting? In other words, or I should say better screening. There's more knowledge, there's more awareness, more young people are getting screened, so it's getting caught. Or are young people really actually getting cancer at higher rates than before? Rodney, do you want to?
Yeah, actually, the data says that over the last 25 years, young people, the onset of cancer is increasing by over 79%. So it's real. More and more young people are getting cancer at early age. And the question is, it almost goes back to what I was referring to before. How do we get to those young people? Because they have very different expectations maybe than we do or our parents have as well. And they want to live a long life. They want to live a great quality of life. And they're well educated, and they're on TikTok, and they're looking at the latest and the greatest of what's happening. And so they're coming to providers with questions and maybe their own answers. And I think it's really upon us to make sure that we're doing the work. And so one example of the work that Novartis is doing to sort of reach those young people, we have partnered with the NFL on an initiative called Crucial Catch. And what it does is it's just another educational tool where you might find some young people. I mean, there's about 70,000 people that go to these NFL games at every stadium across, and about 17.5 million people. And so we're just trying to find new ways to get to the young people and educate them. But we're also trying to make sure we are doing the work in our labs and with our research and our development teams to understand better how we can actually treat patients early, in the earlier stages, not just at the advanced stages of metastatic, but at those early stages. So these young people, and by the way, the fastest growing segment of patients surviving cancer nowadays is 85 and above.
Wow.
Right? And so what that means is you have to reach both. Mm-hmm. And I think both of them want the same thing, high quality of life. And so that's the key for Novartis, and our research and the work that we're doing is we're trying to make sure we're bringing medicines to patients earlier and early in the treatment cycle as well.
Do we have any idea why younger people are getting cancer at higher rates than before? Like what's going on?
I think it's an area of active research. There are hypotheses in terms of lifestyle, nutrition, and it's under active investigation versus proven point at this time. But we'll see within the next few years if we can learn more. Maybe I can share some more data about what Rodney was talking about. Probably we've done one of the last screening trials in colorectal cancer, 40,000 patients that we looked at them 2019 to 2022. And colorectal cancer has a precursor, polyps in colon. And what we've noticed in our trial was the rate of advanced polyp diagnosis in young patients was way more than what we thought. And it was previously reported in older screening trials. So what does this mean? It's probably in terms of future, it would get worse before it gets better, since those polyps, a few years after, some of them become colorectal cancer. And I think that highlights again It's on us to figure out the best way to make sure even young patient population get access to the most innovative life-saving screening technologies which are out there.
Do you think maybe the guidelines need to change? Various cancer societies have guidelines for when to start your mammogram, when to start PSA, and they tend to be sort of start 40s, 50s-ish. Do we need to move that down?
So, when we look at colorectal cancer, the field that we studied very deeply, it was highly debated a few years back when they reduced the age of screening from 50 years to 45 years. And one of the elements that they need to consider is, yes, the rate of cancer in youth is going up, but still it's much lower than older patients. And for colorectal cancer screening, gold standard is colonoscopy, pretty safe, but not completely safe. So when they're looking at the risk-benefit of doing colonoscopies in younger patients, there is some minimum threshold that they need to see in order to really recommend reducing the age of screening. But I do believe, like when you're envisioning the future of non-invasive cancer screenings, stool tests, blood tests, down the road, maybe there would be breath and saliva tests added, other kind of biofluid tests gets added. When they are that non-invasive, and the risk would be much, much lower, it's just the risk of maybe blood draw, we can be more progressive in offering some solution for younger patients that maybe other methodologies are having harder time to justify in terms of risk-benefit.
I think we're seeing that in prostate cancer as well. They're not just taking a blanket approach, so they're saying those patients that may be more at risk, they should actually, instead of getting their first PSA at 50, now they're saying at 45. So you see Black patients now with high risk factors, patients who are living in rural communities, high risk factor, and veterans as well, very high risk factor. So I think it's being more focused on those patients at high risk. Let's start to have that first test a little bit earlier than we're saying for the general population, because again, it goes back to, if you don't remember anything else, early diagnosis saves lives, period.
Can I ask a question? This is something I'm interested in. It's not my area of expertise, but one of the things that they imprinted in us in medical school was that when you think about screening tests, you think about the cost and the benefit, but in particular, you think also about the risk, the detection versus the false positives.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons not to do patients who might be in lower risk groups is because of the detected cases, a higher percentage of them will be false positives. I think there's a shift in the attitude of tolerating false positives. That's something that I hear again and again, and especially in Silicon Valley. I think people want data, and they want data about themselves, and they feel like they can be the guardians of their own data, even if there's false positives. So I don't know if that's something you're encountering.
Actually, I'm going to add to that. See, now we're really putting you two on the spot here. So I remember, do you remember, this would have been, gosh, years ago, when they moved the Preventive Services Task Force tried to move the age for mammograms to be older? And women did not like that.
They revolted.
Yeah,
yes.
They revolted, and so they kept it the same.
Yes.
And what I kept hearing from the people who were in favor of making the age older was the false positives. And we're exposing people to radiation, and we're giving people false positives, and then you have to follow up, and you're tense, and you're spending the money, or your insurance company is spending the money. And what I heard a lot of women saying was, don't pat us on the head. We're okay if you give us a false positive. We will live through the emotional trauma of having to get that checked out. I want information. I'd rather you give me a false positive and increase the chance that you're going to catch a real cancer. So anyhow, any thoughts on what Alex and I just said?
Yeah, maybe I can start about this. This is a very interesting debate, especially when we are talking about a complicated healthcare system. On one side, some of the services offerings are becoming consumerized. People are self-paying. I want to get access to whole body MRIs. I want to get access to, a test that can look at 400 things with even questionable evidence of what works, what doesn't work, what's the accuracy, false positives. And it's just the empowerment of consumers in terms of being informed, even if it's noisy information. But when we go to the other side, of building equitable, accessible solution. Not only we should convince that consumer, We should convince guidelines bodies, we should convince payers, we should convince regulators, we should convince some of the employers, as the really the payers for over 130, 140 million beneficiaries, I believe, right now. It become kind of factorial and important. But what does not change in either case is the power of the voice of consumers. Like in that example of mammogram, all of us, all of you, have a very powerful voice to make an influence of what could happen to you in years to come. If you're interested in some of the topics that we are talking about, you can pick up the phone and call some of these guideline bodies. You can talk to your representative in the Congress. You can join some of the patient advocacy group to move some of these agenda forward to bring brighter days for yourself and your kids. Talking about false positive and the accuracy of the test, at the end of the day, we need to make sure the risk-benefit outweighs toward the benefit. In the medicine, the first principle is first, don't do harm. And sometimes we say, everything that we do to patients is going to have some harm. Let's figure out how much benefit we can add and make sure that that benefit is much higher. I think this debate would continue, and as a result, for colorectal cancer, it's prime time. Colonoscopy is the next kind of reflex test. You see some positive signal in blood, colonoscopy is accessible. For other cancer types, we are doing clinical research with National Cancer Institute and many KOLs to build that evidence of what's the best way to generate access for patients.
I think it was probably about 15 years ago or so where the community, the medical community, changed the guidelines on PSA testing. Mm-hmm. And they said, hey, the benefits don't outweigh the risks. We don't recommend PSA testing, and men organizations aren't as strong as the women organizations. So it took longer for that to reverse that guideline. And I think what you said is there's just more tolerance. Like, what's happening if a patient has a PSA and it rises? It doesn't mean you have prostate cancer. All it's saying is go see your provider and have a conversation and see what you need to do. Maybe you need to wait and see if it rises again, but it forces a conversation with your provider versus not doing a PSA and then finding out you have prostate cancer at stage 4 and there's not much you can do about it. So I think that's why that tolerance is, because when you see the data, it is so clear. I go back to the Johns Hopkins study to repeat it. 20-year survival rate for men who get diagnosed early for prostate cancer is over 95%. Over 95% are surviving. So I think that's why this type of tolerance is so acceptable.
That was a great question, Alex, and that was some great insights. We'd love to take some questions from all of you now. Raise your hand, I'll point you out, and we'll get a microphone to you. So you'll be first, right here at the front, but don't talk until you have a microphone, because no one will hear you.
Hi, Audrey Davis, Cancer Support Community. Thank you for sharing your expertise and thoughts. I have 2 questions, if time allows.
Audrey, can you speak up a little bit?
So sorry. 1, can we talk more about subcutaneous injection and administration of immunotherapy and the promise there, if you have any thoughts on that in particular? And then 2, we know that the vast majority of people with cancer are getting treated at community oncology practices, not academic medical centers. What you mentioned today is so promising and very exciting, but what kind of organizational or institutional strategies and partnerships do you have in place to ensure that this information about these available treatments is getting to these community oncology practices, and that we're building trust with people with cancer and also their loved ones in these new therapies?
For the first question, whoever answers it, can you repeat it?
I'll let you go. Let you take the first, and I'll take community oncology if that's
okay. Great. The question was about subcutaneous immunotherapies, and I'm happy to talk afterwards. I don't have a specific answer around them. I think we're seeing a bunch of advances in different flavors of immunotherapy that include infusions of cells, include vaccines, which are injected, include drugs. And I think there's an increasing interchangeability among these. What we're really seeing across all of these is that we are talking to the DNA inside of our immune cells. And we're giving them instructions in the language of DNA. And all of a sudden, that's like coding, right? You really think of this as, this is a cell that naturally has its instructions from DNA, but can we deliver, whether it's mRNA to teach it or a new genetic modification with CRISPR, DNA sequences that AI helps us design, all of these are designed to give new instructions to immune cells. So I think we will see a number of different routes of administration that will become increasingly easy to deliver. I think that the key thing that we have to get to with all of these first is efficacy. Do they work and do they cure? And as I said, we are seeing that for certain diseases, and we need an investment in research and innovation to figure out what's still lagging behind for the diseases that are not responding. That will come, and all of these things will converge. And I'll just add one last thing. I hope it also converges with what you heard today about early diagnosis. Right now, so much of this is being proved out on end-stage patients who don't have any other options, and we're still seeing successes. If we build a track record and show that these can be safe, effective, delivered in a scalable way, all of a sudden we can have a much accelerated path from patients who are at early stages, early diagnosed, never have to go through the prolonged journey, and still get the benefits of these targeted immunotherapies. I think that's collectively what we should all be working towards.
Your second question was around community oncology and what are we doing in that space to sort of improve. So I'll actually speak specifically about the initiative that I mentioned earlier. Novartis has partnered with Zero Prostate Cancer, and this is all about working in the community. We are working with them on educating patients, community advocates. We're partnering with other patient advocacy organizations, and we're going into sort of the big cities. We're going into Baltimore and Philly, Atlanta, we're going into DC, we're going into LA, New Orleans, Houston. Like, we're going into these communities where we know these patients exist, and we're having conversations with churches, with barbershops, with other community organizations to spread the word. And then I think what we do is, if you have a more educated patient going in to see their provider, that provider is going to almost have to have that conversation that's critical and important for them in order to keep those patients there. And so, of course, we're working closely with provider organizations as well. So we're hitting it on the entire ecosystem we're really working very closely with to make sure everyone is improving their knowledge and their understanding of how, if you get screened and you have the right therapies early, outcomes are much better.
So I think we have time, unfortunately, for only one more question, and I'm so sorry about that. The gentleman right there in the red shirt.
Hello. So I do work with radioligand therapies, and there's one that's called Lutathera that's used for prostate cancer. The dose is $20,000. So I want to lay the groundwork for how are we going to be able to control the cost of these new therapies that are coming out?
And you have 1 minute and 41 seconds to control the cost of cancer drugs, so go ahead.
Yeah, I think that question is probably for me. No, hey, I appreciate the question in regards to the therapies and the cost of all these drugs. You heard about CAR T, a lot of new therapies, the costs are very high. And I'm not going to speak for Novartis only, I'm actually going to speak for the pharmaceutical industry and say what the industry is trying to make sure, and specifically Novartis, is that all patients have access to our products regardless. And Novartis, we are absolutely committed to all patients have access regardless of income. If we're going into communities where patients are underserved, we don't, and I think you might have mentioned it earlier, Alex, you have to sort of take this economic piece out of the equation and make sure that they can get access to it. So we have numerous programs in place so patients can get drugs for free, and make sure that patients can get access to services that will allow them to not only understand what those costs are, but how they can actually pay for it as well. So I can't solve that one in 10 more seconds, but I will tell you that there's no reason why, if a patient is diagnosed with one of the diseases that we talked about, that they can't get access to the Novartis medications that exist for radioligand therapy that you were speaking of specifically.
Well, thank you all so much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I know we could talk forever. And thanks to the three of you. That was really terrific. So thank you so much.